The man at the bus stop. The morning was cloudy, the kind that wrapped the city in a gray blanket, making everything feel slow and heavy. People walked with their heads down, umbrellas in hand, even though the rain hadn't started. On a quiet street, corner near a worn-down bus stop, a man stood alone. He wore a plain brown coat, wrinkled at the sleeves, and on his feet were a pair of old, beat-up leather shoes. They had deep creases across the top, and one sole was starting to separate from the rest of the shoe, held together with a bit of black tape. Some people glanced at him as they passed, thinking he was just another tired soul trying to get through the day. But one man didn't just glance. He laughed, loud, sharp, and cruel. He pointed at the old shoes and shook his head. The laugh echoed down the street like a slap. "Look at those shoes," the man said, still laughing. "What, did you dig them out? Of the trash?" A few people nearby turned to see what the fuss was about. Some smiled awkwardly, not knowing whether to laugh or look away. But the man with the worn shoes didn't respond. He just looked at the man who had laughed, his expression calm, almost sad. His eyes weren't angry, just tired. He didn't speak. What nobody realized at that moment was that the man with the old shoes was Keanu Reeves. He didn't have a camera crew following him. He wasn't dressed for a movie set. There were no bodyguards, no assistants. He looked like just another person waiting for the bus, and that was exactly what he wanted. Keanu had always been different. While other stars chased red carpets and flashing lights, he found comfort in quiet places. He rode the subway, ate alone at small diners, and sometimes just walked the city streets without telling anyone who he was. Today was one of those days, but it hadn't started as just a quiet day. That morning, Keanu had woken up feeling the weight of something he couldn't explain. He'd had a dream about his younger self, the boy who used to ride his bike through the neighborhood, shoes full of holes, knees scraped, heart open to everything. The boy who believed in kindness, even when the world didn't seem to care. He remembered the days when his family had little money, when dinner was rice and beans 5 nights in a row, and his only toy was a broken action figure with no arms. Maybe that's why he had kept the shoes. They were a reminder of where he came from. He could have worn any pair from the rows of expensive shoes he owned. He could have called his driver or ordered a car with the tap of a button. But he didn't. He walked to the bus stop in those old shoes, thinking about who he used to be, and when the man laughed, it didn't hurt the way it might have when he was younger. But it did something else. It reminded him that the world hadn't changed as much as he had hoped. The man who laughed was named Derek. He was in his early 30s, dressed in a crisp suit, his shoes polished so bright they reflected the sky. He worked in finance, made good money, drove a car that cost more than most people's homes. But Derek had one problem. He judged everything by how it looked. He saw Keanu's shoes and saw weakness. He didn't see the story behind them. As the bus approached, Keanu stepped forward. Derek did too, still smirking, still amused by the moment. The bus doors opened with a hiss. People stepped on, swiping their cards. When Keanu reached the door, he pulled out a small, worn wallet. Inside was a bus pass. He tapped it gently and moved to the back of the bus, sitting by the window. He didn't look back. Derek, still riding his wave of superiority, sat across from him, watching. There was something oddly familiar about the man with the old shoes, but he couldn't quite place it. The ride was quiet at first. People stared at their phones, looked out windows, or dozed off. Then, about 10 minutes in, something happened that changed everything. An older woman got on. She was using a walker, struggling to step up into the bus. The driver didn't move. Nobody stood to help. Keanu rose from his seat without a word, walked to the front, and gently helped the woman onto the bus. He spoke to her softly, asked if she was okay, and guided her to the seat he had just left. She smiled, touched by the kindness, and nodded. That moment struck something in Derek. He watched it happen, confused. People didn't do that anymore, especially not men who looked like they had nothing, especially not men with shoes like that. He felt a strange discomfort in his chest. Guilt, maybe, or shame. But he didn't say anything. The woman leaned toward Keanu and whispered something. He smiled, nodded again, and returned to the back of the bus, standing now, holding the railing. His eyes looked out the window, watching the city pass by like a movie. 20 more minutes passed. The bus stopped near a hospital. Keanu pressed the button, the bell chimed, and he stepped off. Derek couldn't help it. He followed. He didn't know why. Maybe he wanted to figure out who the man was. Maybe he was curious. Maybe deep down, something had shifted inside him. Outside the hospital, Keanu walked to a small bench and sat down. He pulled out a brown paper bag, opened it, and took out a sandwich, peanut butter and jelly. He took small bites, lost in thought. Derek stood across the street, pretending to check his phone, but really watching. He was starting to feel a knot in his stomach. Then it happened. A nurse walked out of the hospital. She saw Keanu, smiled brightly, and came over. "He's doing better today," she said. "Still sleeping, but stable." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You really don't have to come every day," the nurse added. "He wouldn't want you worrying like this." "I know," Keanu said. "But he's my friend. He was there for me when nobody else was. Now it's my turn." The nurse nodded and went back inside. Derek heard every word. He stared at Keanu, his mouth dry, his throat tight. He suddenly remembered where he had seen that face before, not just in movies, not just on posters. He remembered a story he had read years ago about how Keanu Reeves had gone through more loss than most people could imagine. His father left when he was young. His best friend died suddenly. The woman he loved lost their child, then died in a car crash. He had faced pain, deep and quiet, yet he never let it harden him. And now, here he was, sitting outside a hospital, wearing old shoes, eating a simple sandwich, caring for someone who had once helped him. Derek felt a lump rise in his throat. He took a step toward the bench, but something stopped him. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Keanu stood, folded the paper bag, and placed it in a nearby trash bin. Then he walked slowly into the hospital, his shoulders low, his steps quiet. Derek stood alone, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt small. He looked down at his own polished shoes, suddenly ashamed of how clean they were. And that's when something unexpected happened. A small girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walked past him with her mother. She looked at him, then looked down at his shoes and whispered something to her mom. "Those look too new," she said. "He must not walk very far." The mother smiled, said nothing, and they kept walking. Derek stood still, frozen, the words ringing in his ears. And inside the hospital, Keanu walked into a quiet room with a single bed where an old man lay sleeping, machines beeping softly. He pulled a chair beside him and whispered, "I'm here, old friend." And just as he sat, the man stirred, opened his eyes slightly, and whispered something back. "You kept the shoes." Fade to black. The story in the shoes, the rain had finally arrived. Not heavy, not violent, but soft and steady, like the sky was letting out a long, quiet sigh. The hospital lights reflected off the wet pavement outside, and the hum of passing cars sounded, distant, muffled by the mist. Inside, the room was silent except for the gentle beeping of a heart monitor and the slow rhythm of breathing from the bed. Keanu sat in the same chair he had sat in every day for the past 6 months, the soles of his old shoes resting lightly on the tiled floor, still damp from the walk. The man in the bed, James, lay still, his eyes half closed, lips trembling with sleep or memory or both. Keanu didn't speak for a while. He just sat there, watching his old friend breathe. He could hear the rain tapping on the window, like fingers drumming softly on a table. Outside, the world moved fast, people rushing, chasing, building. But in this room, Time moved slowly, gently, like it knew how fragile everything had become. Eventually, Keanu leaned forward and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small cloth and began wiping the mud off his shoes, his movements careful, almost tender. It wasn't vanity, it was ritual. These shoes weren't just something he wore, they were something he remembered. James had been more than a friend. He had been a lighthouse during a storm. When Keanu was younger and sleeping on couches between jobs, James had given him a room, a warm meal, and something rarer than both, kindness with no strings. They had met by chance at a bus stop, much like the one from the day before. James had seen Keanu sitting in the cold, shivering, wearing shoes held together with hope. He had asked him a simple question, "Do you need help?" And that question had changed everything. The shoes Keanu wore now were the last gift James ever gave him before he got sick. They were already old back then, already worn, but Keanu never threw them away. He had worn them through some of the worst moments of his life. And strangely, some of the best, too. The soles may have thinned, but they had carried him through. Through heartbreak, through silence, through years of learning how to be gentle in a world that rewards the loud. Now, as he sat beside James again, those shoes had come full circle. It was almost poetic. Meanwhile, across the city, Derek sat in his high-rise office staring at the floor. The sound of rain on glass filled the room, and the brightness of his screen did nothing to push back the gloom in his mind. He had looked up the man from the bus. It didn't take long. Keanu Reeves. How had he not recognized him? Maybe because fame hadn't worn him like it wore others. Keanu's face hadn't been carved by vanity or styled by ego. It had been softened by grief, by humility. Derek had mocked the shoes of a man who had worn them through a kind of fire that polish could never protect against. He opened a browser tab and began reading. Stories flooded the screen. Stories about generosity, about quiet donations, about treating crew members to meals, giving away millions, refusing to live above others. Not because it made headlines, but because it was who he was. Story after story. Subway rides. Handwritten thank you notes. People saying he listened when they spoke, really listened. And the shoes, even the shoes had stories. Photos over the years, those same shoes appearing again and again, like a thread woven through time. Derek leaned back in his chair, unsure of why his chest felt tight. He thought about the girl from the street, the one who had whispered about his shiny shoes. She hadn't meant to hurt him, but children have a way of seeing through things, cutting straight to the truth with eyes. Untouched by pride, and what had she seen? Someone who didn't walk far. Someone whose shoes hadn't lived. That night, Keanu stepped out of the hospital and into the rain again. The streets glowed under streetlights, slick with water, reflecting the world in streaks of gold and gray. He walked without an umbrella, letting the rain touch him. People passed by, hunched under hoods, rushing home. Nobody noticed the man with the old shoes. And he was fine with that, but then something strange happened. As he walked past a bakery closing for the night, a boy, maybe 12, maybe younger, ran out the door and nearly bumped into him. The boy stopped, looked up, and blinked. His clothes were thin, his shoes too small. Keanu smiled and stepped aside, ready to keep walking. But the boy stared at him, not with recognition, but curiosity. "Your shoes," the boy said, pointing. "They look like my dad's. He's always fixing them." Keanu paused. "That's a good skill to have," he said. "Your dad sounds smart." The boy nodded. "He says if you take care of something, it'll take care of you." Keanu smiled. Again. "He's right." The boy hesitated. "People laugh at his shoes sometimes, but he says people who laugh don't understand the road he walks." Keanu knelt down, not minding the rain. "You remember that," he said gently. "That's wisdom." They shared a quiet moment before the boy's mother called from inside. He ran back, waving. Keanu stood slowly, his knees aching but his heart warm. Across the street, under a bus shelter, Derek stood watching. He hadn't meant to follow. He hadn't planned to be there. But something had drawn him, like a compass slowly turning back to where it was meant to point. He watched Keanu walk into the night, shoes soaked, head high, and in that moment, something shifted inside him. He looked down at his own reflection in a puddle, the sharp suit, the perfect coat, the spotless shoes. He saw a man dressed like a success story. But underneath, he saw the truth. A man who had forgotten the difference between looking like something and being something. The next morning, Derek made a decision that surprised even himself. He went into his closet, pushed past rows of shoes and boxes, and pulled out a pair from years ago. They were scuffed. One sole had a crack. They smelled like dust and memory, but they had walked him through his first job, his first failure, his first sleepless night wondering how to pay rent. They were his story, buried under years of pretending he didn't have one. He put them on. They didn't fit like they used to. They fit better. He walked outside, feeling the gravel underfoot, every step louder, more honest. But as he turned the corner, heading to the same bus stop where everything had begun, he saw something that stopped him cold. The bench was empty. No brown coat. No quiet man with tired eyes. Just a small piece of paper, folded neatly, resting where Keanu had once sat. Picked it up and unfolded it with careful fingers. There was no name, just one sentence. Some roads can't be walked in new shoes. The road not walked. The sun returned the next day, but it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like light arriving late, showing up after the moment had passed. The streets had dried, but the memory of the rain lingered in the corners, in the cracks of the pavement, in the smell of damp brick. Derek stood under a tree near the bus stop, holding the paper in his hand like it might dissolve if he let go. He kept reading the line over and over. Some roads can't be walked in new shoes, like it was a riddle or a lesson, or maybe a quiet kind of forgiveness. He had expected to see Keanu again. Maybe not that day, maybe not even that week, but part of him thought this story had another chapter waiting to be written right there on that sidewalk. He had even worn the same old shoes again, the ones with the cracked sole and the laces that didn't quite match. And yet, when the bus came and left, and the bench remained empty, Derek felt the silence more than he ever had before. He sat down, the paper still in his hand, and for the first time in years, let himself feel small again. Not the kind of small that comes from failure, but the kind that humbles you when you realize how little you really understand. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking at his shoes. They were more comfortable than he remembered, but not because they fit his feet better. They fit his story better. They belonged to a version of himself he had buried under years of polish and posture. A woman sat next to him. She looked about, 70, maybe older, with silver hair tied in a loose braid and eyes like deep water. She didn't say hello. She just looked at the paper in his hand. "He left that for you?" she asked, her voice thin but steady. Derek looked at her, startled. "You know him?" The woman smiled. "I know of him. He comes here sometimes, sits, listens, never speaks much, but when he does, you remember it." Derek folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. "I didn't know who he was. I just laughed at his shoes." The woman didn't flinch. "Most people laugh at things they don't understand." He nodded slowly. "Why does he come here?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, its cover bent and edges frayed. "He writes," she said. "Not stories, not books, just thoughts, moments. Sometimes he leaves them behind. Little notes for people who need them." Derek furrowed his brow. "Why?" She smiled again, softer this time. "Because most people won't ask for help, but everyone needs something, even if it's just a sentence to carry." They sat in silence, and for a moment, It felt like the world had slowed down just for them. Later that afternoon, Derek found himself standing in front of a bookstore he hadn't entered in years. Not the glossy kind with clean lines and espresso machines, but a narrow, cluttered place where books were stacked like forgotten memories. Something had drawn him there. Maybe he thought he'd find another note. Maybe he just wanted to walk where Keanu might have walked. He stepped inside and was greeted by the scent of old paper and something deeper. Nostalgia, maybe. He wandered without aim, fingers brushing against spines and covers. Then, tucked between two thick novels, he found a small journal. Its cover was blank. Inside, the pages were untouched, empty, waiting. Without thinking, he bought it. That night, in his apartment high above the city, Derek sat at his desk, opened the journal, and wrote his first sentence. Not for business, not for anyone else, just for himself. When you stop walking to impress people, you start walking toward yourself. He didn't know if it was true yet, but it felt like something Keanu might say. 2 weeks passed before Derek saw him again. It was at a small community center on the east side of town, a place where volunteers handed out warm meals and donated coats. Derek had started coming quietly, helping where he could, trying to remember how to serve without expecting to be seen. He was carrying a box of canned goods when he heard the voice, low, kind, familiar. Careful with that. Your back will remember it tomorrow. Derek turned. There he was. Keanu stood by the table, placing soup cans one by one into a row. His coat was the same, his shoes were the same, but his eyes looked different now. Not because they had changed, but because Derek could finally see them. You left a note, Derek said. Keanu looked at him. I left a reminder. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. They worked side by side for hours, handing out food, picking up wrappers, holding doors open. At one point, a child hugged Keanu's leg and said, "Thank you." Keanu just smiled and patted the boy's head. Later, as the volunteers began to leave, Derek stayed behind. He sat on the edge of a bench, his hands dusty, his shirt stained with sauce. Keanu sat beside him. No ceremony, just presence. Derek took a breath. Do you ever wonder if you've done enough? Keanu looked out the window. Every day, but then I remember, enough isn't a number. It's a direction. The answer sat in Derek's chest like a weight that didn't crush him, but kept him grounded. You walked through a lot, Derek said. How did you not break? Keanu thought for a long time. Then he replied, some people bend, some people burn, but some people, they turn pain into something soft, like a place to rest. I wanted to be that place for someone, even if it was just for a moment. And in that quiet moment, Derek realized something he hadn't known he was searching for. Not admiration, not answers. Just a living example that it was still possible to live with grace in a world that had forgotten how. The sky outside had started to dim, and Keanu stood slowly. You should keep walking, he said. The road only ends when you stop choosing it. Then he was gone. No fanfare, no goodbye. Just the sound of his old shoes walking softly into the evening. And Derek sat alone, the echo of those steps following him, louder than any applause he had ever received. The weight of silence. The city had a strange quietness after midnight. Not complete silence. No city ever really sleeps, but the kind of quiet that lets a person hear their own heartbeat if they stand still long enough. Derek walked the empty streets, hands in his coat pockets, his old shoes clicking softly against the sidewalk. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something he couldn't name yet. The world looked different at this hour. Shadows stretched longer, lights flickered softer, and even the air seemed to carry the echo of unspoken things. He hadn't planned to walk this far. He hadn't planned anything, really. It was supposed to be just another day at the community center, another few hours folding clothes, handing out soup, quietly trying to balance some invisible scale inside himself. But that day, Keanu hadn't shown up. Derek waited longer than he should have, his eyes drifting to the door every few minutes, expecting that quiet figure with the old shoes to appear. He didn't, and for reasons he didn't fully understand, that absence sat heavy on his chest. So he walked, not towards something, but away from the feeling that maybe he had already missed something he wasn't ready to lose. He passed by a familiar diner, its neon sign humming, letters half lit. The place looked tired, like it had seen more heartbreak than it had tables. He stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled with a worn-out ring. An older woman behind the counter gave him a nod without asking what he wanted. He sat in a booth by the window, the kind of booth where confessions tend to spill out at 1 a.m. His eyes wandered around the room. The cracked vinyl seats, the salt shakers filled unevenly, the tired man in the corner nursing cold coffee. It was a place that held stories in its walls, stories that nobody ever wrote down. A small napkin holder sat on the table in front of him. Stuck between the napkins was a folded piece of paper. His heart skipped. He pulled it out carefully. The handwriting was familiar. Some people wait for the storm to pass. Others walk through it and learn the sound of their own steps. Derek stared at the words, no signature, no explanation, just a feeling, like someone had left it there for him, knowing exactly when he'd show up. He looked at the waitress. "Who left this?" She shrugged. "Man comes in now and then, orders coffee, doesn't drink it. Always leaves something. Behind." Derek nodded, holding the paper like it might vanish. He didn't know what he was chasing anymore. A person? A purpose? Maybe both. Maybe the two had somehow become the same. He left the diner without touching the coffee she brought him. The city outside was darker now, but less cold. Something had warmed inside him, though he didn't know if it was hope or just the memory of kindness. In the days that followed, he searched without telling anyone. Small places. Places that felt like echoes of quiet footsteps. A bookstore with dust on its windows. A laundromat with flickering lights. A park bench near a forgotten fountain. At each place, he found nothing. No Keanu, no notes. Just the silence, again. And yet, something had changed. Because now, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of presence, like someone had once stood there, like something had been left behind, invisible but real. Then, late one evening, he returned to the hospital. He hadn't meant to. His feet just brought him there. The nurse at the front desk recognized him. "He's not here," she said gently. "But his friend, James, he passed away last night." Derek didn't speak. He just nodded. The nurse walked around the desk and handed him a small box. He left this, said if someone ever came asking again, to give it to them. Inside the box was a pair of shoes, not the old ones, a new pair, still simple, still humble, but untouched. Resting on top was another note. Some shoes are meant to walk alone. Others are meant to be passed on. And underneath, something more, personal. "Thank you for walking with me. Now walk for someone else." Derek sat down in the hospital hallway, the box on his lap, the weight of it heavier than it looked. People passed by, some crying, some quiet, some lost in their own pain. But Derek didn't move. He remembered the first time he had laughed, and the first time he had listened, and now. The first time he had truly felt what it meant to walk in another man's shoes. That night, he took them home. He didn't put them on, not yet. He placed them by the door, like a promise waiting to be kept, and across the city, in the quiet corner of a forgotten diner, a waitress swept the floor and found another note under the salt shaker. "Leave no footprint without purpose." The shoes by the door. The shoes sat by Derek's door for 6 days. Not touched, not tried on. just sitting there, silent but not quiet. He passed by them every morning, every evening, and sometimes in the middle of the night, he'd find himself sitting on the floor across from them, staring like they might blink or breathe. They weren't just shoes anymore. They were a weight, a memory, a message, and maybe something more. An invitation to become someone different than he had been on the seventh day. He woke before the sun. No alarm, no noise. Just a restless sense that the day was asking something from him. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, the city still dim, the windows painted with shadows. And then, slowly, he got up, walked to the door, and knelt. His hands hovered above the shoes for a second. Then, with quiet hands, he untied them, slipped them on, and stood. They fit. Not perfectly. Nothing real ever does. But they fit enough. Enough to walk. Enough to begin. He didn't take a cab. He didn't call anyone. He just stepped into the morning streets and walked. The shoes made no sound on the pavement, like they had learned how to move gently through the world. Derek followed. No path, no schedule, just feeling. He passed a bakery where a woman was placing fresh loaves on a shelf. He stepped inside and bought two. One for him, one for someone else. He didn't know who yet. He kept walking. A few blocks later, he saw a man digging through a trash bin behind a drugstore. The man's coat was torn. His shoes were made of duct tape and hope. Derek didn't hesitate. He offered the bread. No words. The man looked at it, then at him, and nodded. No thanks needed. No names exchanged. Derek kept walking. He stopped at a bus stop and sat, not waiting for a bus, but for something else. Maybe a moment. Maybe memory. A girl walked by with her father, holding his hand. She looked at Derek's shoes, squinted, and said, "Those look like they've got stories in them." Her father chuckled. Most good ones do. Derek smiled more deeply than he had in months. By afternoon, he found himself at the edge of the city. Not the tourist edge, the real edge. A place where scaffolding outnumbered trees and kids played soccer in dirt lots because there were no parks. He stood outside a small community school with chipped paint on the door and drawings taped to the windows. Inside, laughter echoed. It was a rare sound in this neighborhood. He pushed the door open slowly. A woman greeted him. She looked worn but kind, the way people do when they've given more than they've received. She asked if he was lost. "No," Derek said. "I'm trying to walk in the right direction." She looked at his shoes. "You're close," she said. They put him to work. No forms, no questions. Just hands, just help. Cleaning out an old storage room. Painting a cracked hallway. Reading to kids while teachers caught their breath. Derek didn't tell them who he was. Not the money, not the job titles. None of it mattered here. As the day ended, the woman walked over and handed him a glass of water. They sat together on a bench that squeaked with every movement. "You've done this before," she said. "Not like this," he replied. "I used to give with conditions. I used to think kindness had a receipt." She didn't say anything, just nodded. Then she said something that stayed with him. "People don't remember how shiny your shoes are. They remember who you stood beside when theirs were falling apart." They watched the sky change colors, and that's when it happened. One of the kids ran over, a boy no older than 7. His face lit up when he saw Derek, and without saying a word, he bent down and touched Derek's shoes. "These," he whispered. "These are the kind that walk with you." Derek felt his throat tighten. Later that night, as he walked home through the cooling streets, he passed the bench at the old bus stop. It was empty, of course, but something shimmered on the wood, a folded note held in place by a smooth stone. He picked it up. The journey doesn't end when you change shoes. It begins when you stop running from who you could be. There was no name, but Derek didn't need one. He turned the note over. On the back, written faintly in pencil, was a small drawing. It was a pair of old shoes, and beneath them, one word: continue. The shoes we leave behind. The morning came slow, like a song winding down at the end of a long night. The city yawned, still rubbing sleep from its eyes. Derek stood by his window, holding a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. Outside, people moved like threads in a giant tapestry, some in a hurry, some already tired, some just trying to feel like they belonged to something bigger than the day ahead. It had been 3 months since he'd first laughed at a stranger's shoes. 3 months since he met a man who didn't try to change him with speeches or arguments, but simply by being still in a world too loud. The shoes, those shoes, were worn now. Not like Keanu's had been, not yet, but getting there. Scuffed. At the toes. Cracked at the edges. And every mark told a story. A story that didn't belong to Keanu anymore. It belonged to Derek now. And maybe someday, it would belong to someone else too. That morning, he knew what he had to do. He packed a small bag, a notebook, 2 sandwiches, and 1 clean pair of socks. He looked at the shoes by the door, the ones Keanu had left behind, and nodded to them like they were an old friend. Then he walked out, locking the door behind him. Not just his apartment door, but the one in his chest that had stayed shut for years. He returned to the school first, painted walls now. Fewer cracks, more laughter. The boy who had touched his shoes ran to him again, this time with 2 other kids in tow. They didn't say much, just high-fived him and kept playing. Joy didn't always need words. After that, Derek walked back to the community center, not as a visitor anymore, but as someone who belonged. He showed a new volunteer how to stack supplies in a way that wouldn't topple. He taught a nervous teenager how to make coffee without burning. He didn't give orders. He offered space. But the day wasn't about staying. He had somewhere else to go. By dusk, Derek found himself at a quiet cemetery on the edge of the city. It was the kind of place most people passed by without noticing. No grand statues, no names, in gold. Just weathered stone, grass that grew too freely, and birds that didn't seem to care about human grief. He walked the rows until he found the name. James, a simple marker. No dates, no titles, just a name carved in stone, clean and soft. Someone had left a smooth rock on top. A tradition of respect. Derek sat on the grass and took out the notebook. He opened to the last page and began to write. You never knew me, but I knew you through him. I wore the shoes he gave me, and now I understand why he kept yours. It wasn't because they were comfortable. It was because they reminded him who he was when the world tried to make him forget. I think maybe we all need something like that, something to carry us until we can carry others. Thank you for walking beside him, so he could teach the rest of us how to walk on our own. He folded the page and tucked it under the stone. Then he took off the shoes. He placed them neatly beside the grave. Not because he was finished walking, but because it was someone else's turn. That night, Derek walked home barefoot, not as a statement, just because the earth felt real under his feet, like he could finally feel the world again, not just step on top of it. He reached his apartment late. The city had gone quiet again. On his doorstep was a package, no name, no return address. Inside was a single item, a new pair of shoes. Simple, familiar, and folded underneath, one final note. When one road ends, another begins. You walked with me. Now someone will walk with you. No signature, but it didn't need one, because Derek already knew. The next morning, he returned to the same bench where it all began. Same street, same bus stop. But this time, he wasn't waiting. He sat with the new shoes on his lap, looking for someone. Someone tired, someone lost, someone who might not look like much to the world, but someone who needed to be reminded that their story mattered. And then, he saw him. A young man, standing alone, eyes down, clothes worn, hope fading around the edges. Derek stood, walked over, and offered the shoes. No speech, no explanation, just the gesture. The man looked confused. "Why?" he asked. Derek smiled, soft and quiet. "Because someone once did the same for me." And in that moment, everything came full circle, not with noise, not with glory, but with grace. Because sometimes the loudest legacy is the one that walks beside us quietly, step by step, until we're ready to take the lead.